Hi, welcome to Genre Talk. I'm Carol Cummings. I'm here today with Andrew Q. Gordon, author of the Champion of the Gods series.
Hi,
Say
Carol.
hi,
How are you?
Andy.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
We're doing well today.
Yeah, this is our first ever interview,
Yeah,
video interview. So, you know, be prepared for who knows what.
we'll see how many mistakes go on today, right?
Okay, so we're doing this video interview in 3 parts. Today we want to talk about basically your series and talk about genre and so forth. And Tuesday, what are we doing Tuesday? We're doing more in the series
The, see,
and the
it'll be
character.
mostly it'll focus on the new book. Book 4 comes
The
out
new
on
book.
Tuesday.
Correct. Oh
Child
yeah,
of Night
release
and
day
Day.
for you coming up. Woo.
Yep.
And then
Child of Night
Wednesday,
and Day.
Child of Night and Day. And then Wednesday, we're going to do some reader questions from some good people who left us some stuff on our Genre Talk group. If you're not in that group, go and join. But today, let's start out, since we are Genre Talk, let's start out with genre. And
Okay.
obviously, these books are in the fantasy genre. So tell me about what attracts you to that, and define the genre the way you define it, not the way it's defined by bookstores and publishers.
Well, for me, I'm a big fantasy fan in the sense of I do like all kinds. Like urban fantasy is great, and paranormal kind of fantasy that way. But for me, there are two main kinds of fantasies that I like, and it's epic fantasy and high fantasy. And to be honest, I like an epic high fantasy, so that the series, an epic fantasy, is one of those series that takes 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 books to write. Harry Potter was epic. Game of Thrones is epic fantasy. Lord of the Rings, those kind of things are epic fantasy. High fantasy is just the sword and sorcery, magic, that kind of element. And it can be one book, it could be 3 books, but it's typically that's what that's defined. So I like high fantasy that ends up being epic.
So you basically, you tell big stories. This series, you could not have contained the story that you're telling in one book. These are big stories.
Correct. There's like this. If you read book 1, you're going to be left wondering what's happening next, and if you read book 2, you're going to be really wondering what's happening next, and so forth until you get to book 5. So, in order to find out the resolution of the conflict for the story for the Champions of the Gods series, you have to read all 5 books.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas some stories, if you read one, it's sort of like Lord of the Rings. You get left. In book 1, you get left when everybody's gone. They split up, and then book 2, you're left again. I mean, you don't know what's going to happen, and then in book 3, they wrap everything up. So that's how my stories are, right?
Mm-hmm. So I would like to know what got you started. Like, what book when you were a tiny boy? What blew you? I mean, was there a particular book when you were young that you went, holy crap, fantasy?
The first real fantasy book I read was Lord of the Rings, and I remember I was like 12 when my mother brought me a copy home. And I honestly don't even remember why she did. That's kind of lost in the recesses of ancient history. But I do remember getting the book, and I remember reading the whole thing, and then I pretty much bought every fantasy book I could afford or that I could find and things like that when I was little. And like when we moved from where I was until I was younger to where I ended up, in high school, they had like a used bookstore that was pretty much if it wasn't in walking distance, it was certainly in biking distance initially, and then driving distance when I could drive. And I pretty much would go in there every week and to see if they got something new or something I didn't read or something I hadn't had. And so that Lord of the Rings was probably the first, and then following that, I think probably the other one that I really thought was wow was Stephen Donaldson's The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the first book, and the second book too. But the first book was out in complete form when I started to read it, so that was like the other major wow for me when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like they influence what you do?
Not so much Donaldson. I think Donaldson's was more of a moral struggle for the main character, Thomas Covenant, and there was like it was his moral struggle and what he did, and then there was the whole world that the fantasy wrapped around it. Whereas I think that in The Lord of the Rings, which was I think much more of an influence for me, that was the grand overarching plot, and it was told over multiple books, and there was like a save, let's try and save the world. And so yeah, I think it would be hard to say that Tolkien doesn't influence me, because I think he influenced so many fantasy writers between that came up after him, and so that we all are sort of we all sort of trace our roots back to that as our influence for high and epic fantasy.
Well, a lot of people say he invented modern fantasy, and I think as far as world building goes, he kind of showed us all how to do it. Whether he gets a lot of crap for it now.
Right, but I mean, he also created like a whole new language. It's like he created like the modern the modern day would be like Klingon. Like Roddenberry and the whole Star Trek universe created the Klingon language to go with his story. And so I mean, he wasn't necessarily a writer by trade. He was a professor of Old English, and so languages really interested him. And so he created his. I don't know if he created his language to tell the story, or the story created the language. I think it was a little of both. But yeah, he was not an author by trade, like in the sense of like Jules Vernon or Mark Twain at those times. He was a professor who wrote these books. And the interesting thing is that he gets a lot of credit for it, but he wrote these in the 30s, and really it didn't become 30s and 40s, and he didn't become really popular until like the 60s, 70s, and beyond.
And when the hippies picked him up.
I guess you could say that. I mean, I don't know if the hippies could.
I know a lot of the history behind his resurgence in the 60s and 70s, at least from what I've read, came from people thinking that the pipeweed was a reference to pot, and that's how the book started making the rounds in the hippie circles. I wasn't there. I couldn't say.
I would imagine that pipeweed really referred to just tobacco, but
yeah, well, knowing Tolkien, yeah.
I don't see he and C.S. Eliot sitting in the back of their exclusive little English club at Oxford, smoking some hooch, and rolling the fatty and things like that.
You don't know.
No, I don't.
It's a fun mental picture, though.
Yeah, their little English hats and the big pipes and this stuff.
Oh boy. Okay, but I mean, I would say that we've learned lessons from the early, Tolkien included, on what not to do too. I often say you don't need to know the color of the dirt in Helm's Deep, but I mean, as far as immersive world building, and yours is very immersive, is what I'm saying. So and not that you learned that from Tolkien, but I feel like it's he kind of showed people it's a modern, a present day story, present day in terms of whatever story you're telling, that a present day story is more interesting when you at least have an idea of what the backstory was.
Right. I mean, he had, my understanding is that he wrote, or he had all these notes that ended up becoming the Silmarillion. And that's sort of what he based his world on. And I won't say that I have thousands of pages of notes that I can refer to and history of the world and stuff like that. But I will say what I did was I wrote the majority of the story, like 90% of it, and somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1.3 million words, before I condensed it down into the books that they ultimately became or will become when book 5 is done. And the reason that was helpful was that there were certain like stories that the characters were telling each other that I had to create and put together that formed the basis for the back history of the whole place. Like, so what happened, and how did Kell do this, and what happened back in the ancient times, and and so because I had written those scenes, even though they got deleted, or they never made the light of day, or they never got they got parsed out or something, it gave me a history that I could then rely on when I needed to figure out what I was going to do with something and to keep it consistent going out through the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense. So, okay, let's move on to diversity.
Okay.
So, I know that you have different cultures, different religions. Your world is pretty vast. What are your thoughts on diversity in what you write and what others write? How important is it to you?
Well, I think fantasy was one of the very first places that allowed, when I say allowed, had gay characters in a positive light. And so fantasy has always been about, I read a great quote. I think Scott Coatsworth put it on his site. But essentially what it was is that the fantasy is the only place that talks about tomorrow in a hopeful manner. You look at it, I mean, it shows you tomorrow instead of talking about it. This is what, fantasy is going to be. This is what the world could be. This is what it's going to be. And so diversity is sort of, really helpful. The problem is for me, and I don't know, this might be a knock on the series from my perspective, is that there really isn't the vast degrees of cultures like here. Like, there's no Asian population, there's no African American, there's no African populations, there's no Hindu or Indu, like those kind of different cultures. There's just sort of like a homogenous people, and then there's like, but there are dwarfs, and there are other beings and there are other creatures, and so there is their own little prejudice that are worked in. But to me, the root of all like bigotry and racism and hatred and stuff like that comes from needing to feel better than somebody else. So the characters do engage in that. So like in one instance, there's like a lesbian couple, and one of them is a very powerful wizard who is very prominent in the conflict. And characters are listening in through magic on some of their adversaries, and one of them says, "Oh, she's a woman-hating whore, or a woman-loving whore," something like that. And he does it not because they're homophobic in this world. It's just that he needs something to try and knock her down because she's better than he is. Without it, and objectively, she is a much better wizard than he is. And so he uses this to try and degrade her, in his mind at least, into others. So there is that. You have to. I think you can't have a world that doesn't have any of that. So like like in Tolkien's world, the wood elves were looked down upon by the high elves, and then the humans were looked down upon by all the elves, and then the humans.
Nobody liked the dwarves.
Right. And then right, exactly. And then the Numenorians look down on the people that didn't go to Numenor. So everybody has their like who's better than who, and so there's definitely some of that. Like some people don't like wizards, some wizards don't like non-wizards. Dwarves don't like humans, so to speak. Humans don't like dwarves. I mean, you do have that kind of bias or culturalism. So what you try and do in the books is you try and show interactions between the two that break down those barriers.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. I think that we are going to leave it there for today and pick up tomorrow, where we want to talk more about your new release, because tomorrow, Tuesday, is release day.
That's correct.
So
I have to tell you, I'll talk more about it tomorrow, but it has been a long time coming. I think I submitted the first half of the book in April of last year.
Yeah.
So it's been a year, and I probably started writing it a year before that probably started. So it's been a long time. So I'm still in book 5 mode now, and so I have to try and remember what I quit book 4.
Well, you take the time until we come back to get your mind on book 4, because we do want to hear about it.
Okay.
But all right, that's it for today. Join us tomorrow and then again Wednesday for our first ever video interview with Andrew Q. Gordon.